All right, looks like we are now live, and
Whoa, fantastic.
today's guest here is the MPP in Brampton East, Gurratan Singh. Thank you very much for joining us. Perhaps maybe you could start give a little background of what brought you here, and maybe you could talk a bit about going to law school and all that.
Connection right now. I think we're good. You haven't lost me, have you?
Yeah, looks good now. All right, I think we've stayed stable now. I think. Okay, I see the thumbs up.
Okay, we're good. There's a little bit of lag, but let's make it happen and see what happens.
Okay, so maybe tell a little bit about your background to the students here, and a little bit about who Gurratan Singh is.
Yeah, for sure. So we're actually just reminiscing. Your professor and I, we went to law school together, or he was just my senior a little bit. So clearly, I was in good company. I went to Osgoode Hall Law School, and I focused there on when you enter into Osgoode, it's such a wonderful environment. But I took an interest in defense work, so that was kind of the focus of my studies. And afterwards, that was a big part of what I actually practiced in, which is in defense work. But what motivated me from the beginning to get involved in law was this idea that with our job, we can have greater purpose. And the purpose for me always was I wanted to help people out. And I also wanted to challenge what I thought and what I felt were systems of inequity that existed. So that concept of how can I challenge, how can I fight against those systems that I found were perpetuating a systemic injustice, systemic racism, over incarceration of Black and brown bodies, over policing of individuals. So I saw the law as an avenue to do that, because by involving myself in the system, I would be able to challenge the system through the appropriate means and measures. So that was what motivated me. That's why I wanted to get into law, to fight for people, to stand up for people. And that's ultimately what led me into politics.
Right. So then, what makes your decision then to go from the defense work and then say, I want to get into politics now?
So my story about politics is a bit different than I think most people's stories, because I have this huge history of working in politics alongside my brother, Jagmeet Singh. So if any of you are watching, you're getting kind of confused, like, this guy looks kind of familiar. He's not Jagmeet Singh, but it kind of looks like Jagmeet Singh. I get it all the time. I'm his brother, and I've worked alongside with him, side by side, in his initial political career. And even now, I'm a big supporter of all the work he does. So I got to see politics for 10 years, about 8 years actually, prior to getting involved. So I got elected in 2018. My brother got elected in 2011 and had his first election in 2011. And in that process, I got to see how being involved in politics, how much you can fight for change. And I saw my brother take on issues of affordability, from fighting against really unjust and unfair auto insurance rates in Brampton. And, raise your hand up if any of you feel like you're paying too much auto insurance. That's my brother was, fight there. Hands are going up. So my brother fought on that. And also, even beyond that, the oppressive working conditions of temporary work agencies, looking at carding. And if you looked at all these issues that my brother was talking about, they're ultimately issues that disproportionately impacted racialized and marginalized communities. If you look at one of the arguments put forward around auto insurance, is that it's largely, you talk about temporary work agencies, it's a lot of women in these spaces. And you talk about carding, that disproportionately impacts Black communities. So, I saw how he could raise this issue forward, and it motivated me to want to fight in the same way. So when he ran for leadership and ultimately got elected, and there was an opportunity to serve, I said, I want to keep the fight on. I want to keep on fighting and standing up for people.
Perfect. So, so you mentioned a couple of issues there that we've been talking about predominantly, and one of them being systemic racism. So what can you say, maybe you can share some maybe personal experiences, because everyone, in a person of color, I mean, we've gone through these situations. What advice perhaps you can give to these individuals about kind of keeping the fight going?
Yeah, so it's important first to acknowledge that often when we have this discourse about racism and systemic racism, it's often in the context of America, and the challenges and the issues that America has with systemic racism. And in that discourse, what we found and what we saw is that when people were pointing their fingers at America, there's a lot of opportunity for activists and organizers and people who were fighting for justice locally in whatever country they were to look internally at the systemic racism that exists in their own nation, in their own communities. And when we saw with the terrible and unjust killing of George Floyd, we saw a movement across the world raise up. And it was really important that we take this opportunity to examine ourselves and recognize that Canada people on the slavery of Black people and the oppression of racialized individuals. Talk about systemic racism, we need to look at it. Go ahead.
Oh, I see. It just cut out there for a bit, so I'm not sure if you can maybe repeat that a little bit.
You have to repeat the question.
Right. I said, yeah, with respect to systemic racism, I think it cut out when you were answering there. So perhaps maybe you want to go backtrack a little bit.
Okay, perfect. Just tell me, we're having a little bit of, we're hitting one of those data points where I think you lagged a little bit as well right now. Say that last one again.
Right. So perhaps you may want to rewind a little bit there with your answer, because I think it may have been lost.
Oh, no problem. Okay, I'll start from the top then. So basically what I was saying is that we saw with George Floyd, the terrible, unjust killing of George Floyd, we saw a movement across the world where people were standing up and rising up against systemic racism and injustice, and specifically anti-Black racism. And many folks across the world, as they stood in solidarity, they also took that as an opportunity to examine their own communities and their own countries. And in Canada, it's really important to recognize that when we talk with systemic racism or systemic anti-Black racism, it's not enough to say, oh, it exists in America and that's it. We have to look at the roots of Canada and how we are founded upon systemic racism. We are founded on the genocide of Indigenous peoples. We are founded on the slavery of Black people and the oppression of racialized communities. That is something we must work to dismantle. And so when we talk about systemic racism, we must look at systems and institutions and how to combat systemic All good? Did I get through?
Yeah, I think the very last sentence there kind of started to lag again or pause there. I'm not sure.
I think we're just second. See if this helps. 1 second. I'm just trying to. Let's see if this works at all. Okay, I'm back. Are you there as well?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, let's see if this connection is better or not.
Okay, so I see the white bars, so I see 5 bars there. So I think that's good on your end. Hopefully that works.
Okay.
So I mean, recently some of my students were watching the decision in Ontario, and again, specifically with the police institution, we're seeing again feelings of, well, what's going on here, right? In your defense work, what are your thoughts maybe on that case, and what would you say to people feeling a little discouraged, again, with what's happened?
I'm sorry, you just cut out a little bit. What case is that you're referring to?
Ontario, the one with Devontae Miller there in the Durham region.
Devontae Miller, yeah. So that's something that it was tragic. First, it's really important to recognize that what happened is just so disheartening. When you talk about the circumstances in which you're talking about DeAndre Campbell, is that what you're referring to?
Devontae Miller.
Devontae Miller in Oshawa.
Yeah.
Devontae Miller. It was very disheartening to see, such a use of force that resulted in Mr. Miller's loss of his eye. You see that it was a very brutal and very incredibly, violent attack. And it's something that we need to look really closely at and examine how this violence that is so casually placed upon a Black individual is representative of anti-Black racism and systemic anti-Black racism. And we must really look at how we need to look at reforming and approaching policing in a new manner in which we don't see this kind of use of force and this unjust actions and violence placed upon people. So it was something that was disheartening. It was something that it hurt me, and something that is indicative of anti-Black racism in the sense that we see time and time again acts of violence being committed against Black and brown individuals.
Now, related to that, in the Peel region, there we had Ijaz Chowdhury, and again, that now looks at mental health supports and police responding to these situations. What are your thoughts on what happened there, and another tragedy, and how can these things be avoided?
Yeah, so even like let's look at the backdrop of Ijaz Chowdhury, right? 2 months prior to that, we had DeAndre Campbell, in which we had another situation where we had a Black individual who was going through a mental health crisis, who was then shot and killed in his own home by the police. And that's something that I also raised this issue at Queen's Park. 2 months later, you have a situation of Ijaz Chowdhury, and it's really just breaks my heart when I think about how unjust the situation of Ijaz Chowdhury was, in the sense that you have an individual who's going through a mental health crisis, a family who's recognizing this individual is going through a mental health crisis and decides to call the paramedics, not the police, because they recognize this is a healthcare crisis, not a police emergency. When the police do arrive, you see Mr. Chowdhury alone in his home, and he is then shot and killed in his own. And it's really demonstrating that there's something broken, something really broken right now in our system, where when a person is going through a mental health crisis and people ask for help, the response is police and their guns drawn. We cannot have this. And enough is enough. It's something that I've been calling for at Queen's Park. We need to ensure that people who are having mental health crises are met with a healthcare response, not a police response. And overall, we need to really look hard at our police system right now and re-examine how we do policing with respect to mental health, with respect to issues of demilitarization and needing to demilitarize our police, with the sense that we need to start investing in services that people need to get by and services that people need, as opposed to always going towards a confrontational approach with police.
So what can we do in terms of how would some people are saying things like defund the police or look at other resources? What do you think is something that could better handle a situation like that?
So around this time, I'm really proud to say that the Ontario NDP, we put forth a vision, a paper on how we can do policing better. And it looked into what those folks who are even saying defund the police, what they're really looking towards, and the issues that they're bringing up is issues around a lack of funding on mental health issues, a lack of funding towards community initiatives, towards de-escalation or community investing in communities in general. They're looking at issues around the militarization of the police and the fact that we need to invest in de-escalation and often demilitarization of police. We need to make sure we have a healthcare response, not a police response to healthcare crises. That's what those folks are saying, and that's what we're presenting and putting forward, a vision of how we can think of policing differently and start investing in the services that people really need around mental health and around these services to address the systemic racism that exists in the police right
now. Now, is there a need to get beyond maybe like the SIU, or are they being able to handle situations like this fairly and effectively?
The SIU is in my position, and in my opinion rather, it's broken. We know it's broken. When we look at DeAndre Campbell, we see that the officer who shot and killed DeAndre Campbell 2 months later did not have to ask one single question, did not have to answer one single question by SIU, because the SIU has no mechanism to compel police to participate in investigations. That's a broken system. And so when we look at what's happened is we see the Ford government has repealed previous legislation that would have given greater powers to SIU. They brought in their own legislation, but their own legislation is not coming to effect. So the SIU has no powers to hold police accountable right now. How can we have an independent body of individuals hold police accountable when they have no power to hold police accountable? And I don't think the SIU is the appropriate mechanism right now to often investigate a lot of these killings. And that's why we need to have a complete overhaul of the SIU to ensure it really goes back to its core roots of being able to hold police account in violent interactions.
Now, you have a role essentially as the critic of the Attorney General. Is there anything the Attorney General here in Ontario can do better to address some of these issues, or is this something that the government has to look at in terms of an independent body?
I think across the board, all parties, all members of the governing party, all members of the current Conservative government, all across the board need to address this issue of systemic racism and systemic anti-Black racism that exists and perpetuates throughout and manifests itself in many different ways. Like we all know, Justice Tulloch has come out with a lot of different reports around systemic racism. We have in the 90s, the commission that was put forward on systemic racism in our justice system. We know there's a problem with systemic racism, and it permeates in many different bodies, including our justice system and beyond.
Now, switching gears to COVID-19, what specifically for the people in Brampton East, what more can the government be doing to really help people getting through this unprecedented times?
Well, what we really have seen in terms of the government's response is that the Conservative government has really relied on the federal government's CERB and other forms of support for everyday folks, but they actually have not presented a form of support from the Ontario provincial government. So if you look at other provinces throughout Canada, we see different provinces have put forward different kinds of support for people who are in need, for people who fall through the cracks of CERB or other kinds of federal support systems. So what we're saying is that the provincial government needs to put forward a similar system of support to help renters, to help small businesses, to help people who fall through the cracks of CERB, to make sure they get the support they need. We haven't seen that from our provincial government. So they need to do a lot more. They also need to continue ensuring that testing is being done at the highest levels, because we know there's been, for months, struggles with the government in terms of addressing issues around making sure we're testing properly. We can only reopen the economy appropriately when we ensure we have the correct data to see where we're at. And that only can happen when we have appropriate testing. So there's a lot that can happen right now, a lot that needs to be done. And we're not seeing that kind of leadership coming forward from the provincial government. There's also beyond that, in Brampton East, one of the biggest issues is auto insurance. We talk about all the time that people are still driving less. I can still drive from Brampton to Toronto and go to Queen's Park in half the time that I did prior to COVID. But people are still paying the same rates. We said, hey, step in, legislate laws to ensure that insurance companies have to charge people less. There's a lot that people are struggling with and a lot that the government can do that they're not doing. And we're saying you need to do more, and you need to ensure that people who are struggling right now are getting a break, and it's incumbent on the government to do so.
Yeah, I share that point because I live in Brampton, and I was talking to my auto insurance company, and I was saying, well, I don't even drive at all. I've driven maybe like 300, 400 kilometers in 4 months, and my rates don't really change. But is there something perhaps looking at auto insurance like in other provinces without reference to the postal code you live in, or is there a different mechanism that you would propose?
Yeah, so I put forth legislation on this point, and I specifically, so let's just talk, when we talk about auto insurance, it's important to look at a few things. First off, even before COVID, people were paying way too much for auto insurance, okay? And Ontarians pay some of the highest auto insurance in this country, despite having some of the safest roads. So we already have a system of auto insurance which is broken. Secondly, during COVID particularly, we have a situation where we know, statistically, I pulled up the stats and we saw that in the months of, I looked at between like mid-April to May, I took a snapshot of 2020 versus 2019, and there was such a drastic, like probably upwards of 75% or more reduction in accidents that have happened in Brampton during those 2019 period and 2020 period, because there's less people on the road. Well, in those kind of circumstances, we need those savings. Clearly, insurance companies are saving money if there's no accidents, not paying out claims, need to be passed on to consumers. It's not happening, so that's a huge issue. Now, with respect to postal code discrimination, and we call it discrimination because it doesn't make sense. If you live in Brampton and you don't have any accidents, you should not be being charged more because of your neighbor or because of someone else in your community. You should be paying rates based on where you live, you should be paying rates based on your record, not based on where you live. And that's what I believe in, and that's what we're fighting for and pushing for. And I put forward legislation on it. My colleague, Tom Kojovic from Humber River Black Creek, he put legislation separately, but also to reduce auto insurance costs in general. And we're not seeing the government budge on this issue at all.
Now, how have you found representing the people of Brampton East during COVID-19? Has it been certainly more challenging, but how have you connected with your constituency, and what ways has COVID-19 taught you to kind of go out of the box?
COVID-19, first of all, I need to, first state that it's really a tragic situation. People are in tough positions, and the world has changed dramatically, and it's important to acknowledge that. It's changed the nature in which I do my work as well, but we've tried our best to adapt. So using platforms like Zoom, in some ways it's actually facilitated meetings in a bit of an easier way, because back in the day, calling 3 months ago back in the day, prior to COVID, when you don't want to do a meeting, you need to have a bunch of people to get in their cars and drive or take transit to get to my office, and I'd host a meeting there, or I'd have to go into the communities and I would have to, connect with them in those areas. Now on Zoom, I can get 20 people, with a click of a button together and have a discussion, have a conversation. It's not a replacement for in-person communication, but it does allow for that gap to be filled. And in general, what we're seeing is we've had to rely on other forms of communication, like telephone town halls and more telephone communication and digital. I'm pretty active on social media. I use social media a lot. So we're trying our best to stay connected. And it's despite the hurdles of COVID, my job as an elected official is to keep on connecting and talking to folks, and I'm trying my best to do so.
Now, we were talking about Therio before, and one of the things that was very interesting was they live streamed that decision. I think we had at one point 20,000 people were tuned in. Is that something that maybe the Attorney General or the courts can be, whether courts or tribunals, is that something that seeing such level of interest? Whereas, in a courtroom, especially when you have social distancing coming into play, at most you can hold maybe 50 interested onlookers. What are your thoughts on maybe getting those decisions or getting parts of cases available in that format to the general public?
Yeah, it's interesting because the courts are open and public spaces that anyone, that's a pillar of our democracy, the fact that you can walk into any trial at any time for the most part, and hear about the evidence being told or given or judgments. I think we need to modernize more in our courtrooms. I think that's something that's important, and I think that this judgment demonstrates the fact that people are interested and they want to know, and they're getting, I think, increasingly interested in understanding how our justice system works and how it impacts marginalized communities.
And how has in terms of Queen's Park, how was Queen's Park running during this time? And
Queen's Park, it's very, very, it's interesting because there initially it was as humans face adversity, we continue to adapt and move forward. And I think one of the adaptations that we have seen is that at Queen's Park, we've learned to function and come together in a manner which allows us to maintain social distancing, but also continue our job as opposition to hold the government to account. So we have less people going to Queen's Park at one time. We have different segments, if you will, like you have a group of people who will go a couple of days, and that same group of people won't mix with another group of people who will go another different couple of days. Voting has changed. There's now a voting system that allows for more people to vote in a social distance manner. So there's been a lot of changes, but ultimately our job stays the same: to hold the government to account and make sure that people are getting the support they need in these tough times.
You've been posting quite a bit about, well, what's the new normal going to look like? And is it a situation where once we get through all this and can we return to how things were before? What are your thoughts on what the new normal, once we get through COVID-19, should look like, and what should the government of Ontario here focus on?
we talk a lot about the new normal. And what I recently did a TikTok on it actually, and I talked about we can't go back to the way it was. We need to make things better. We need to demand better. And I think what we're seeing now is that this argument that certain people made about needing to cut services or needing to reduce the size of healthcare, and these kind of arguments, or bring in privatization to healthcare, these certain rhetoric that people are bringing forward has really been disproven in a COVID-19 context, where we see how important public healthcare is, and how by having public healthcare, it has put Canada in such a more stronger position to oppose COVID-19. We've seen the need for the support that government can provide for people who are in need. And I'm very proud of the work my brother did in pushing the federal government. Jagmeet Singh pushed to make sure we had even a CERB to begin with, and pushed to make sure we had a $2,000 CERB, then pushed to make sure payroll was at 75%, then pushed to make sure that students were included. And he's continually pushed, because it is demonstrating that this is the time that we need to reimagine what the role people have in society and how government can help them out. And I think that new normal looks like a future where people have universal access to medicine through universal pharmacare. It's a future where people have universal access to daycare, something that everyone should have the right to and the ability to access, where life is affordable, where people aren't struggling to buy homes, where education is affordable, where internet is something that everyone should have access to, because we can't function with it anymore. If you want to have an education right now, you need to have access to internet to do so. So we need to reimagine what our society looks like, and we can't go back to how things were. We must go back to how they should have always been, a society where we take care of one another.
Now, do you have any thoughts on how we can essentially afford all of those services, or what ideas perhaps can make these ideas become a reality?
Yeah, so if we look at it provincially and federally, whenever they talk about how do we afford this, how do we take care of this, how do we pay for these things? Well, no one asked the federal Liberals how they're going to pay for upwards of $10 billion pipeline. No one asked, when we how we're going to pay for all the court costs associated with the Conservative government slashing our green benefits and then being brought to court. No one asked how we're going to pay for the Conservative government when they threatened to challenge bring in the notwithstanding clause to reduce the size of city council. Those factors are not asked how we pay for it, but we often ask how we're going to pay for these social services. Well, it's very clearly how we're going to pay for it. It's very easy. You have to ask the super rich to pay their fair share. My brother's been arguing about the fact that we have billions of dollars currently hidden in offshore tax havens. We have to make sure here provincially that we have the richest, biggest corporations paying their fair share to ensure that we have a common good. And so I think it's clear that the money is there, but we just have to make sure that those who are in a position to give what's fair for the rest of us.
Now, related to, you're talking about long-term care homes and a lot of the breakouts of COVID-19 there, and it turns out a lot of these places are going to gain financially for them. What are your thoughts on private long-term care homes and what's happened there?
Yeah, it's clear. It's clear that long-term care has demonstrated how much private long-term care facilities and private healthcare is a failure, and how we've seen a really clear case where publicly funded long-term care homes had a far better standard of care and living for its residents than private facilities. I'm not a proponent for private long-term care. I think we need to keep public health care public in all areas and all realms, and that's something we're committed to fight for.
Now, some of my students are concerned with returning back for their children, specifically in the elementary and high school, of going back in September, and how is that going to happen with those situations where they're going to need childcare and they need to return to work and things like that? What are your thoughts on going back to school, essentially, or the plans to kind of go back to school from the provincial government?
Well, you kind of addressed it pretty clearly right now, that when we talk about going back to school means a lot of things for a lot of different families. Up north, it means in many ways, if they're going to continue physically going, the ability to go there, if they're going to have a component online, that they have access to internet, that here locally we have access to that. If people are in a situation where they have parents working, which is obviously a large group of individuals, then we need to make sure we have adequate and accessible childcare. When we talk about going back, we need to listen to the public health experts to make sure we're going back in a manner which is healthy and safe for everyone, because there's an increasing concern that in the fall we could have, there's fears of a second wave and all these factors. So we need to make sure when we go back in a manner that is both safe by listening to public health experts, but also to go back in a manner that is a new normal, where we start building for a support system that allows people who are in top positions the support they need to go back.
Now, Sid was asking, or I was hoping to ask you about, you mentioned sort of your confidence in the justice system. What specific things there in terms of measuring your confidence, and what can be done here provincially with our justice system to address some of the things you've brought up?
Yeah, so with our justice system, it's very interesting because this issue kind of just came forward recently with the passing of Bill 161, a bill that I voted against because of the issues that it has with respect to access to justice, and the measures put place in that bill that actually hurt people's ability to access justice. So when we talk about how do we create a just system within our courts, well, one thing is legal aid funding is very important. It's important that people have the ability to access the representation that they need. And that means having a robustly funded legal aid system that allows people in precarious situations to do so, legal aid clinics to provide the support and services they need. We need to make sure that we have laws being put in place that allow for people to challenge the government and hold the government more accountable. What we saw with Bill 161 were changes being brought forward that would hurt. We talked, the way the deputies talked about it in committee is that American style of class action changes were being brought into Canada that would make it harder for people to hold class actions and ultimately hold government and big business to account. We need to make sure that the justice system is allows for people to challenge those who have more resources, and that we have a support for those who don't have access to resources to challenge the status quo. There is a specific legal aid clinic that talked about it's called BLACK, the Black Legal Aid Center, or Black Legal Action Center, something as an acronym for that. And they talk about how if you have a society in which you have poverty disproportionately impacting Black communities or racialized communities, and then you're cutting legal aid funding, and then you have the over-policing of Black and brown individuals, well, ultimately cuts to legal aid support are going to result in further inequity. So we have to understand that things are connected and conjoined and combined, and we need to look at things holistically in creating a just system.
Now, if we were to increase funding to Legal Aid Ontario, where specifically should those funding be used? I mean, I know you were a member of a criminal defense bar, right? And is it having more funds for private certificates for the defense bar to get into, or are there specific areas that you would focus on?
I think, what people were arguing for before was that what we've seen is two things, right? We're not even, at this point, a lot of people are not even advocating just for an increase. They're saying, just bring, at least at a minimum, bring things back to how they were prior to the millions of dollars that were cut from legal aid. We've seen from an economical standpoint that people who have proper access to legal aid actually results in more affordability and a cheaper system, because you don't have, if people have access to lawyers, basically, they can navigate a system more smoothly, faster, takes less court time, and there's better decisions and less appeals. So when we talk about funding legal aid, it's not just about criminal defense, it's about across the board. It's legal aid clinics, it's private certificates, it's talking about ensuring that the systems that people need to access to get support are funded appropriately. It's across the board.
I'll turn it back to COVID-19. What about in terms of this pandemic pay that kind of stopped for some workers now that we're a few months in there? Do you think that things like that should be continued to be covered, or what are your thoughts on things of that nature?
Yeah, I think people are struggling. Like right now, it's people are struggling, and we've seen something so devastating, right? Like we've never seen this before, and it's such a drastic position people are in. I think the government needs to step in and keep on providing that support, because ultimately, we can't just think about getting through this. We have to think about how we're going to get back from this. And if we have all these businesses go out of business right now, and default, or if people falling into poverty, well, they're not going to be able to contribute the same way they did before. So investing in people now is actually an investment for the future. That's our argument, and that's what we're going to keep on pushing for, so people have the support that they need.
Now, earlier you mentioned you using platforms like Instagram and TikTok. How are you finding engaging with maybe younger uh, citizens and residents, particularly in Brampton, Brampton East? How have you found sort of those newer platforms and apps?
Well, you know what it is? It's funny because I used to think that Instagram and TikTok were just for younger folks, and then you start looking at the comments, and you're seeing people of a wide variety of different age groups participating in these kind of social platforms. They're tools. They're important to use. In politics, I believe it's important for me as an elected official to go where people congregate. That's my job. If people congregate in different spaces, if they congregate at their faith centers, I should go there. If they congregate at their community centers, I should go there. And if in age of COVID-19, if they're congregating on Instagram, then yeah, I should go there. I should utilize these tools, because I believe that the more people who are turned on to politics will create a more just system. And if I can use social media as a platform to get the people more get folks paying more attention to politics, irrespective of the age group, that's important. But I do obviously think that young people particularly are often cut out of the discussion in politics, and if we're not including them in our discourse, then we're not going to be able to address the issues that impact them.
So we were talking at the beginning that it's been, I think, exactly 10 years. I think around now you'd probably be finishing up with your graduation ceremony at I think it was at the tents back then. So if you could go back 10 years ago and talk to Gurratan Singh then, what would you say as MP Singh in terms of that journey? And what advice would you offer to him getting out of law school at that point to where you are today?
Yeah, I think this is a question I ask myself all the time, because I'm actually an expecting father. So I have a kid on the way in September, and I often think about like the lessons and the thoughts I'll be sharing with my child, and the reflections of my life. And something that I really want to share with folks is like, sometimes when I had this issue when I finished school. I had this idea when I graduated from law school. I'm like, okay, I learned everything I need to learn. Now I got to apply it. And one of the things I now embrace is that I am a student always. I'm continually a student. I'm continually learning, and every day is an opportunity to learn. And I'm trying to read as many books as possible. I'm trying to learn and listen to as much as people as possible. And just to maintain this idea that just because you're done your formal education does not mean you're done learning. If anything, you're actually learning even more and more every day, and that's important. I think it's really important that when we work and whatever we do in life, it's not for, like, we must attach ourselves to a higher purpose. And that higher purpose is something that we must all find inside of ourselves. And I think when you pursue a higher goal, all those other things that sometimes you're pressured to want to get, or sometimes that you need to get, they will come. And so I really think that we need to attach ourselves to a greater why. And that why must always be grounded in this belief, in this idea that we have to fight to create a better world. Because if we all don't join in that greater purpose, that's something that I think is going to impact us all collectively. So I think that's important, that we have a greater purpose connected to helping humanity out in everything we do. And lastly, just don't forget to have fun. Like, sometimes we get serious and we get stuck in this mentality that, I'm a grown up now and I can't smile and I can't have fun. And I think beyond, like, don't forget to have fun, your life must be fun. And in the end of the day, no matter what area you're doing, if you're not loving it, then you have to re-examine it.
Congratulations on that wonderful news. So what, in terms of now looking to the future there for your little one that's on the way, what can you think now yourself of how can I contribute to in bettering the world in the future? What would you like to, if you were to talk to yourself in the future then, and talk with your child and say, well, this is what I had done when I was the MPP in Brampton East and beyond. What would you like to share with the future?
Yeah, it pains me still when I look at stats, both municipally, federally, and provincially, the low voter turnout rate that we have often across the board. And what I think, like, the role that I want to play in fighting a better world, in fighting to create a better world, is by trying to create a better province. And that's why I'm really going to fight hard and push hard to create an NDP elected government in the next election in 2022. And I think that's something across the board that people need to understand, that our civic engagement, our politics, like, talk about Ontario government has a annual budget around $150 billion. Think what you can do with that $150 billion. Think how much positive impact you can create to communities that are struggling right now with that $150 billion, how that can be invested in healthcare, education, and the services and transportation that people need. I think that the way I'm going to try to create a better world is by forming a just government that'll address these issues of systemic racism and injustice and fight to create a province where no one is left behind.
I was going to ask about what's with respect to the discrimination. I mean, recently, like your brother there was kicked out of the House because he identified a racial issue there. Why is it difficult for this to be addressed, and what can be done again in terms of getting this issue brought and taken care of?
It's wild. Like, I remember I saw a tweet. It was like, you can do something racist in the House of Commons and stay there, but if you call that person out for doing something racist, you get kicked out. And I think it demonstrated a really big imbalance right now in the way our House of Commons is set up, and it demonstrated a problem overall with just like where people's priorities are. And we need to challenge systemic racism. And something so simple, like something so at a day and age right now, when you look at the current context we're in, and you have my brother calling on the federal government to acknowledge and work against systemic racism in the RCMP, to say no to that, and then to call that action out as racist and then be kicked out, demonstrates that we need a lot of growing to do as a society and as a country and as our political structures. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that my brother continued to fight, continued pushing forward, and is not backing down from saying that we need to challenge systemic racism head on to create a more just society.
On a lighter note, how often have you ever had an interview or something where someone has just completely mistaken you for your brother, or do you have any sort of lighthearted situation like that?
It's funny. I tell people all the time, almost in a way, just like so people don't feel like uncomfortable. I'm like, even sometimes, like, people from my background, like Punjabi folks, will think, or Sikh folks will get me confused for Jagmeet. You know what I mean? So just like I always like to like people like, hey, don't feel bad about it. It happens all the time. It's just something that bike you around or whatever. It regularly happens. It's funny, and it's often turned into my like intro line where I say, hey everyone, I'm Jagmeet Singh's. In case you're getting confused, I'm actually his unofficial official stunt double, and he couldn't make it today, so he sent me instead. So I take a laugh with it, and more than anything, I'm proud of the work he's doing. So I don't mind getting mistaken for someone who I really look up to. And I think what my brother's doing is really courageous, and I think he's, for racialized people across Canada and across the world, like thinking that we can struggle so hard, our parents struggle so hard to get here, and then the dream of a child of those parents who struggled, then being able to run for prime minister demonstrates, I think, really the Canadian dream for a lot of folks. And beyond that, someone who's willing to be in that position of power and then use it to advance social justice and deconstruct the racism that a lot of folks are facing across Canada and those institutions of racism, I think is really honorable and noble, and I'm very proud of the work he does.
And certainly you should be very proud of the work you're doing, and I'm sure certainly your family is very proud of both of the things that you've both been able to accomplish.
I got we have a old school Punjabi mom who still, I think, deep down inside wishes we're both doctors, you know?
Right there. So perhaps if you have any final words of advice for my students, so looking at the time here, any final words of advice that you can offer them getting through these COVID-19 times and getting through into their future, what could you offer for them in terms of advice, and especially if they want to get into politics?
So for getting involved with politics, I really want to stress how important it is that we get involved in politics across the board, because, you know, politics is something that impacts everything we do, from, you know, the tuition we pay, to the roads we drive on, to the hospitals we attend. Politics is something that impacts everything we do, especially provincial politics. So I say get involved and volunteer at, you know, with whatever politician that you're interested in, you like, because there's opportunities to always create change, and I think that's really important. And this notion sometimes, I don't care about politics, or, you know, like, it doesn't matter if you don't care about politics. Politics cares about you. You cannot care about politics all day long. It doesn't impact the fact that it changes and regulates every action you do in a day. So, you know, it's incumbent that we understand the gravity that politics has upon our lives, and act accordingly. And advice for the future, it's unprecedented, right? So I don't want to be so, you know, I don't want to think like, you know, I have the answers. I don't have the answers. It's really wild what's happening around in the world, and it breaks my heart to see how people are struggling and in the injustice of it all. So, you know, ultimately what I say is we got to take care of each other. And taking care of each other is something that I believe is a policy point. Taking care of each other means those who have more, the super rich, give more, so we can all live in a world where we have access to opportunity. Taking care of each other means challenging systemic racism and direct racism. If you see racism, acknowledging racism in our own communities, in our households, right? As a racialized individual, acknowledging that racialized folks can still perpetuate anti-Black racism, and challenging that in the ways that I experienced it, or the way that I see it manifest, and making sure I'm an ally to those who are experiencing it. I think it's important that we take care of each other, even emotionally, like check in with folks who you might be struggling right now because social distancing is getting to them. So I think we have to create a politics of love. We have to create a politics of that's based on empathy and based on compassion and taking care of one another. And I think that's something that is really important. We all do together. And that's my advice. Let's just take care of each other and get involved in politics.
Thank you very much, MPP Singh, for taking the time to join us today. Wish you all the best in your continued work there for the people of Brampton East. And once again, we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to come and chat with us here on Zoom.
Hey, listen, you're my classmate, man. We went to school together anytime for you. You know, that's fantastic. Let's connect again. I really enjoyed this. I hope it was entertaining for your students. And I'll do it anytime. So especially for you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, MPP Singh.
Thank you so much, everyone. Signing off.
Take
Bye
care.
now.